So the ancient Egyptians, I think everybody knows what a mummy is or what a pharaoh is or seen a picture of the ancient pyramids at Giza, for example. So the Egyptians were a lot different from the Sumerians or anybody who was living in Mesopotamia. Egypt was a unified nation state, as we call it. So there were multiple different cities that were all united underneath a single ruler, ruling out of a capital city. So ancient Egypt goes back 6,000 years. We usually kind of calculate out back then. There is actually ancient prehistoric Egyptian art and architecture, but that's outside the scope of this class. The Egyptians, of course, had a very complex and very interesting religious beliefs. The afterlife, there was a belief in something known as the Ka, which was your spirit, which had to be protected. That existence of a Ka was one of the reasons why there were so many different, very important aspects to the afterlife, preparing for it, etc. Whether you were really poor or if you were the actual king, the pharaoh, you always prepared your loved ones for burial and the afterlife. Some lower class people would just be buried out in the desert, maybe left with some food that would then actually be sort of dehydrated out in the very dry temperatures of the desert. Pharaohs, the kings, would have much more elaborate practices for after their death. They would have a giant pyramid in what we call the Old Kingdom. Pyramids basically represented the rays of the sun coming down from heaven. And these giant tombs then would be furnished with all sorts of different goods, little shwaptis, little miniature figures, which actually they believe came to life after the pharaoh was interred in this giant pyramid. Unfortunately, these various pyramids were all robbed. So even actually by what we call the New Kingdom, which was the second major portion of Egyptian history, they actually turned to what we call the Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Kings were hidden tombs near the capital city, and unfortunately they were all robbed as well, except for very famously King Tutankhamun. He was a relatively unimportant, rather not very interesting king. He died, I think, when he was 19 years old. But guess what? His tomb was never robbed in the ancient world. It was discovered by a British archaeologist, Howard Carter, all the way back in the early 20th century. Ironically, his small, kind of humble tomb had actually been buried underneath the rubble of a more important king. So the ancient Egyptians obviously saw the Nile River as the most important sort of lifeblood still to the present day. It flooded once a year. And in fact, because of the climate, they could actually plant 2 crops every year, unlike in America where it's usually only 1 crop. During the flooding, there was nothing to do as far as farming, so that was when people would travel, or men I should say, would travel up to where the pyramid was being built. They were not slaves, they actually were paid by the pharaoh, but it was also something that was largely compulsory, and they were required as part of their duty to the pharaoh. These pyramids are huge. Most of them are actually very bad condition. The ones that get into your textbook are actually sort of in the minority. The pyramids of Giza are actually in excellent condition overall. I don't want you guys to think of the pyramids as just giant piles of stone, however. They actually are very complex structures. In fact, back in the ancient Greek world, they found the pyramids so fascinating, they actually named them pyramids, which means flame. You might be familiar with the term pyromaniac or pyrotechnics. Well, pyramid means giant flame. When the ancient Greeks saw them, however, they were in much better condition. They had a nice, shiny, white limestone exterior called casing. Unfortunately, earthquakes have destroyed most of the casing stones, leaving sort of the more rough, less refined stone of the interior of the pyramid. Now, unlike movies, there were not just multiple passages going everywhere. Now, the Great Pyramid of Cheops, or Khafre in ancient Egyptian, that is actually a little bit more complex. Actually, there are 3 different burial chambers. Most likely what happened is the pharaoh just kept changing his mind. However, I want you to realize that there were some sort of very primitive booby traps, but nothing like you would see in a movie like The Mummy, for example. Egyptian art was very conservative. It didn't change much over the course of thousands of years, very much about the authority of the pharaoh and his government. You can see that in the pictures in your textbook. So the ancient Egyptians were fascinating to all sorts of other ancient cultures as well. The ancient Greeks and Romans, which we'll start looking at the Greeks in the second week of our class, were endlessly fascinating the Egyptians. A lot of the ideas of afterlife, a very complex hagiography of gods, were very much the product of the ancient Egyptians. They largely just ruled the Nile River Valley. They made it down to what's now what we call modern-day Sudan, the northern portion of that. And they kind of experimented with conquering outside of mainland Egypt, as we'll call it, but for the most part, they were a civilization that was very self-contained. So next, I want you to watch that movie, that documentary about the Great Pyramids. Now, I want you to watch very closely. One of the people who's going to be interviewed is a man named Dr. Zahi Hawass. He's an interesting and very controversial figure. He's very well educated, very intelligent, but you might even notice by the type of hat he's wearing, he sees himself a little bit as sort of an Egyptian Indiana Jones. I want you to think about, how does an art historian balance ethics with promoting his work, his or her work? So Zahi Hawass is a very interesting figure. He's someone who, like I said, he actually got arrested several years ago during the Egyptian revolutions, but now is apparently back in his office that he had before the revolution. So next, watch that, and then proceed on to the discussion question. And then when you're done with all of the different parts of the module, there'll be a conclusion video to watch. That will just sort of recap what you should have learned and what assignments you should have completed for the first week.